Hamantakiapi, good, I was going to say good evening. It's good evening here for us. We're recording, actually, both of us, both Jennifer and I, or Jen and I, are in Piscataway lands. No, we're in Washington, D.C., the belly of the beast, in the heart of empire. It's Jen and I are doing a research project, which we will be happy to share at a future date here at the National Archives. And before we get started talking about what we're going to talk about today, the boarding school report, I just want to say that we will be including a link to some resources for those who may be experiencing some, triggering episodes about the things that we're going to talk about today, specifically related to the abuse of children, sexual violence, physical, spiritual, and cultural violence against Indigenous children. And there are resources out there. The Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition has an excellent list of resources. We'll include it in the podcast notes if those of you who are interested in seeking out resources for yourself or others, or just finding out more about the history of this particular issue. They come highly recommended. We've done interviews with one of the founders of NABS, as it's called, and you can check that out. It's Denise Lajamadir, who wrote a book called Stringing Rosaries, which is actually about a history of Catholic-run boarding schools in the Northern Plains. So you can check that out. We also have some other boarding school episodes, and like this issue is so massive, and this report is so massive in its scope that we probably will be having more episodes to come. So I highly recommend doing your own research, talking to your own family if you can about these things, because there is nobody in Indian country or, as this report points out, in Alaska Natives, as well as Native Hawaiians, who is not touched by this in some way or another. So with that said, I think Jen and I will get started in this boarding school report. This was issued in May 2022, and it came out of the U.S. Department of Interior, which I think everyone should know by now, that is the kind of overlord of Indian affairs, and has been since 1849. Prior to that, it was the War Department, something which we will talk about in the context of this episode. But just to put this into like historical context, on June 22nd, in 2021, Deborah Holland, who is from Laguna Pueblo, who's also the acting secretary of Department of Interior, made a commitment to coordinate a massive federal investigation of the federal Indian boarding school system. And they have created a kind of historical or periodization of the boarding school system, which they date between 1819 and 1969. So about 150 years or a century and a half of boarding school policies implemented by the United States. And as the executive report points out, the United States operated or supported about 408 boarding schools across 37 states or then territories, which included like Alaska or Hawaii, including 21 schools in Alaska and 7 schools in Hawaii. And this report, if you're interested, actually identifies those schools by name. And in fact, NABS, as I mentioned earlier, has a really useful map at showing where these boarding schools are located, and which tribal communities were affected by them. And so I think it's also important to point out that this report also identifies what we know as day schools, which were operating, in their federally run facilities that were operating on reservations where children would go for the day, so to speak. No like regular kind of normal schooling system, but having gone through some of the archives here at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., it's pretty interesting to see the similarities between the policies of the day schools and the boarding schools, especially the way that they attack Indigenous culture, as well as trying to not only reform Indigenous children, but their parents as well, or colonize them, I guess is one way to put it. And just to be clear, This report doesn't say it, but lays out all the evidence for it. And that's the case of genocide. And, under international law, I think it's important to point out right away that the taking of, or the forceful transference of children from one group to another is by definition, under international law, under the UN Geneva Conventions that were ratified by the United States not until the 1980s, ironically. But nonetheless, that is the definition of genocide. And so this is what's happening. And in kind of academic circles and advocacy circles, this is something that's called Indian child removal or native child removal, or just child removal in general, because child removal wasn't just a genocidal practice against indigenous peoples in the Americas, but was also practiced against indigenous African people in the African continent, specifically with the transatlantic slave trade. And in fact, this is kind of a little bit tangential, but I think it plays into the kind of guiding ideology of boarding schools themselves. But in fact, that what Saidiya Hartman has called natal alienation, or the stripping of children from their parents and their mother, so to speak, like in terms of their mother language, their mother country, and their mothers themselves, is a form of genocide, and has been effectively used and practiced by slavers in this country, specifically against African people. And so it's not a phenomenon that just targets indigenous people, but it operates for different ways. And so in the context of the kind of elimination or genocidal policies against African people, that was for enforced labor, right? And for indigenous people, it was to take the land specifically. And also this happened to Puerto Rican children as well, and Filipino children as well. So this is a very kind of widespread policy. And Colonel Pratt himself, Richard Pratt, who is considered the architect of the kind of modern off-reservation boarding school system at Carlisle Indian School, which we'll talk about in a bit. He was commanding mixed. He was a Civil War veteran, but he was also commanding mixed units in the Army of the West when he was fighting in the Indian Wars. And by mixed units, I mean that he was commanding, white soldiers alongside of recently liberated African soldiers and black soldiers, as well as Indian scouts. And he writes this in his book, Battlefield and Classroom, which is kind of an ironic name for an autobiography, which really kind of spells out how connected the militarization of Indian country is with the boarding school system itself. But he says that he was influenced by the Americanization, the quote unquote, what he called the Americanization of the Negro, quote unquote. Those are his words, not mine, where he said it was only through the decimation or the attempted annihilation of their, sense of identity, right? And the taking of them from their families, that they could be fully Americanized, like white people themselves. And so he was saying that after these really kind of bloody wars of conquest in the West, during Reconstruction specifically, post World War or post Civil War, everyone was going back to their communities except for the Indian scouts, who were in effect an auxiliary of the U.S. military, but were going back to the reservation to go in his eyes be Indians and not be civilized and be outside of the kind of Americanizing project, but also to continue to sort of be impediments to westward expansion. And so his idea, arose specifically by saying, well, the only reason why, black folks were successfully militarized, and the kind of great equalizer of, black, white, and indigenous was the military. So he, in effect, saw this kind of martial citizenship as a way to begin kind of this, what we call the process of assimilation, which is really just genocide against a different kind of genocide against indigenous people. And so just really wanted to quickly point that out. And so this report came out in May, and it's it's a very comprehensive report, and I recommend everyone read it. Take some time to read it. It's really difficult to get through. It was hard for me to get through, and it all kind of came at once. But this report, the kind of executive summary of it, was that it found more than 50 grave sites, and kind of concluded that more grave sites would be found, and had identified at least 500 Native American, Alaskan Native, and Native Hawaiian children had died while attending these schools. And one researcher, whose name is Preston McBride, who's been working with NABS, and the International Indian Treaty Council at the United Nations, and kind of doing this research, has come, according to his research, he's estimated that these graves will end up being somewhere around 40,000. So the graves that they identified so far are just kind of a preliminary estimate. And there's also a lot of caution and care around this as well, because just speaking from the experience of something like the Rapid City Indian School in Rapid City, that just this is something that I know about. That boarding school had, I think there were like several grave sites or cemeteries that it had in its existence when children were attending school. And because the land was transferred from transferred from federal trust, Indian trust, into municipal government, i.e. the Rapid City city government, the federal government didn't go out and identify these grave sites. And so there's already been instances of looting and vandalism of some of the grave sites. And so there's a reluctance on behalf of indigenous people and descendants to really identify them, because there's just this long history of grave robbing. So there's multiple factors here, and in fact, this is something that I think it's important to point out, that it affects everyone. And even Secretary Holland, during the press conference and the release of this report, said that her grandparents were both 8 years old when they were forced to attend boarding school. And she said, quote, many children like them never made it back to their homes. Each of those children is a missing family member, a person who was not able to live out their purpose on this earth because they lost their lives as part of this terrible system. Which is it's pretty powerful words, especially coming from the Secretary of Interior. And it is important to point out as well that while Secretary Holland never in her her office never uses the language of genocide, the NABS researchers who were part of this project with the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, they did use the word genocide, not in the report itself, but in the press conference. So there's and I recommend everyone go and check out the press conference. There's a lot that's said. There was James LaBelle Sr., who is in Inupiaq, and is a vice president of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. He said that even though it's ceased or stopped in many places, the vestiges of this is still continuing today. And one of the things that he actually said in that speech as well is that it continues today in the current incarceration of Leonard Peltier. And in fact, Leonard Peltier is a survivor of the boarding school system. And there's, we can include a link to his testimony about surviving boarding school and being taken away. And so he's also, it's part of this kind of carcerality, or the mass incarceration of Native people is part of this kind of eliminatory element of the boarding school system that continues with also attacking political resistance or social resistance in terms of the Red Power movement and the American Indian movement. So that was actually an interesting connection that he made at the start of this. And it's important to say also that basically every school had a cemetery. So if there are over 400 schools, we can estimate that there are hundreds of cemeteries, right? And so this is also just part of a initial report. I think it's the first report of many to come And the context of of this report, I think, is limited actually in its scope because it accounts for what it can see in terms of the archives that exist. And as Jen and I have discovered, that archive is very incomplete, and it's not a full picture. And I think there's a tendency to believe that the United States government kind of has this, you know, eye of Sauron, this all-seeing eye, where it's like it houses all these secrets. And I think it misses the fact that there was a lot of negligence in play in terms of these boarding schools, because if it was just a this kind of really well-oiled machine, it was good at capturing children, no doubt about that, but taking care of them after they were taken is another story, right? And that's what we are finding out here, is because a lot of those children just went missing, and they never returned home. And those who did, suffered the consequences for the rest of their lives. So with that, I think I hopefully did a decent job of giving kind of the kind of present context of this report. And now let's talk a little bit about the summary of this report and what's in it. And so I'll turn it over to you, Jen.
Cool. So, in short, Nick, you're saying Indian policy is military policy. I know this is like an assertion you make throughout your work, but I think reading this report and then, being in the archives, it's abundantly clear that that is the case through and through, right? And I mean, if it wasn't mentioned already, um, Indian Affairs were in the Department of War, which later became the Department of Defense. And now we're the Department of the Interior with plant and animals. um, but I wanted to, I mean, so the way this report opens up is very compelling. It opens up by talking about the capture of Geronimo, and it talks about how, um, as a result of the attack on Geronimo and the capture of Geronimo, a lot of Chiricahua Apache children were taken, and Chiricahua Apache children alone represent 1/4 of all the graves at the Carlisle Industrial School. So I wanted to actually just read from that quote directly. It says, in 1886, the Apache Wars ended when Chiricahua Apache leader Geronimo and his band surrendered to the United States. Critical for westward expansion, the U.S. Senate passed the following resolution thereafter. Resolved that the Secretary of War be directed to communicate to the Senate all dispatches of General Miles referring to the surrender of Geronimo, and all instructions given to and correspondence with General Miles in reference to the same. Although neither Geronimo nor others in his band were charged or tried for crimes under U.S. courts, President Cleveland ordered for Geronimo and his band to be removed from present day Arizona and held captive indefinitely in Florida as U.S. prisoners of war. Under U.S. military control, surviving Apache children were forcibly removed from their families and shipped by train to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. Some children were later returned to their families as confinement of the Chiricahua Apache band extended across U.S. military installations, demonstrating that all Indians, including Indian children, hold a distinct political status in the United States. Some Apache children never returned, compromising 1/4 of Carlisle grave sites. So I had never heard that before, and I thought that was a very compelling way to start this report. And I was, pleasantly surprised at the way they included that Native children hold a distinct political status in the United States, because they do. Native people in general, but I think Native children specifically, they represent the future of Native people. They represent quite literally our future. And so I think, they're very aware of that. There's a reason that child removal is a genocidal tactic. Um, so I also wanted to speak to Secretary Holland's push to do this project. I mean, just from the Pueblo perspective, it's very, very profound that she took this very heavy project up. I mean, I think as Secretary of the Interior, it's her responsibility, but also dealing with death can be a very taboo topic culturally, especially for women. And she demonstrated, I think, bravery, but also like just this dedication to her people and to all Native people by taking this up. And I really like, I pray for her and I think about, perhaps maybe some of the repercussions that she could be getting for this. And I think it sets a precedent for how we as Pueblo people need to move forward, talking about death, talking about the way that we've been implicated in the boarding school system, and being more actively involved in these conversations in the broader sense. Um, so yeah, this is the report is here. The report kind of just lays out like how data was collected, and it's interesting because me and Nick are like looking at BIA archives, and it doesn't explicitly name those, which I think is like pretty relevant because already in this short time we're already finding a lot of pretty relevant stuff. Um, it goes on to describe the boarding school framework, how it works, what the goals were, and then it talks about the conditions, which is probably the hardest part to read. Um, it kind of lists them out by school, talks about boarding schools in Alaska Native villages, in Hawaiian communities, and then schools for the freedmen, which I am so happy they included because the freedmen are always left out of these conversations. Um, and then I also really like how it included um, talking about respect to NAGPRA, but also to various tribes and how they receive remains, or maybe they don't, and how sensitive information really needs to be kept private. Like, because Nick said, there's also precedent for grave robbing, but there's also a multitude of reasons that tribes might not be able to receive remains, or how the intake process needs to be handled with a lot of care and a lot of specificity based on tribes. So I'm really glad it doesn't include too much of that. Um, and then, of course, it talks about the legacy impact, which I think I have some critiques of how that conversation could play out, but we'll save that for the end.
Yeah, that's a really big issue. And just to kind of talk a little bit about the historical, I mean, the research process and the methodology. I know some of the researchers, and I'm trying to get some of the researchers, because a lot of the researchers are indigenous people who are scientists. Like one is like uses ground penetrating radar to find graves and things like that, unmarked graves. Others are people who've done oral histories or have researched the records, some of the records that we're researching at the National Archives. But what's also really interesting is they identified, and I think this is important to point out, they identified 300 or 39,285 boxes, which is approximately 98.4 million pages of quote potentially responsive documents end quote in the American Indian Research Repository, which is related to the history of the federal Indian boarding school system. And why that's important is because the American Indian Research Repository is a relatively recent creation. As I understand it, it was created in the wake of the Cobell settlement. It was basically not all the documents, but many of the documents collected in the forensic audit that Eloise Colbell, who is a Blackfeet banker or was a Blackfeet banker, had collected or demanded to see to kind of account for the centuries of mismanagement of indigenous resources. And I don't know, and I maybe like this is just kind of my own lack of knowledge on this. I only know as it relates to allotment, but I don't know as it relates to the funding of these boarding schools, if or how much money went into if money was mismanaged and how much money went into them, and if that was included in this settlement package. Eloise Cobell had accounted for, from what she could see in the books, was about $174 billion in mismanaged individual Indian money accounts. And so for those of you that don't know what that is, I think it's worth pointing this out, because a lot of this is just so like, is some American Indian people know this, but some don't, because it's very complicated. So as part of the federal trust responsibility, the federal government has this like theoretical or abstract account basically for each individual money or each individual Indian person. Some of that's based on allotments, others is based on like resources, revenue, from leasing lands for like um, grazing or oil and gas development, which happened quite a bit. And that is used to pay for a variety of things. And from what I've seen in the records of Indian boarding schools, individual Indian money accounts are used actually to pay for some of these boarding schools. And there's a per capita, there was a per capita on each individual student, and it varied from institution to institution. So, for example, a Catholic school maybe got like $192 annually, which was a lot during the late 19th century, um, annually for housing children and putting them up or lodging them in dorms and things like that. And a lot of that came from these trust accounts, right? And so $174 billion of mismanaged funds. That's what Eloise Cobell found. And then in 2011, they settled in one of the largest class action lawsuits, $3.5 billion, which is like pennies on the dollar of what was actually taken. And I think there is also not an accounting for other kind of funds and the administration of those funds. And this archives, the American Indian Research Records and Research Archives, was actually created in Kansas to house these materials that came out of the Cobell settlement. And so like a lot of people didn't know about this, like didn't know that these documents existed, and they're not readily accessible. You have to get special permission to actually see them. So that's going to be a fascinating, that's what I'm really interested about, because it's like they've identified they've identified 98.4 million pages of potentially responsive documents, which means we're going to, this report is like the first volume of hopefully many reports that go on, looking at this, because it doesn't just entail boarding schools. It also entails an additional 1,000 plus federal and non-federal institutions that were identified as, Indian day schools, sanitariums, asylums, orphanages, and dormitories related to Indian education, mainly of children. And when you look at the federal classification of Indian education, it was like it was kind of a weird, at certain times, certain periods, it was a weird kind of responsibility. It was also related to civilizing efforts. It had education was conceived of broadly as a civilization project, which included things like the Court of Indian Offenses, which specifically went after children or parents of children who were recalcitrant or who were truant, who left or ran away from boarding schools, or parents who refused to send their children to boarding schools. There were severe penalties in some instances that were placed on this. Like for example, there were a group, I think it was 19 Hopi parents were actually imprisoned. Hopi men were imprisoned at Alcatraz Island, which was a military prison at the time, for refusing to send their children to boarding schools. And in other instances, the idea from the Indian agents themselves, and specifically people like Pratt, they were trying to get children sent to places like Carlisle for a variety of reasons. One was because they would take the children of leadership to essentially, in his words, ensure the good behavior of their parents, because at that particular moment in time in 1879 into the 1880s and 1890s, that was the period of allotment and the reservation period. And so to get recalcitrant indigenous nations like the Lakota Nation to acquiesce to allotment policy, oftentimes they would take the children, because they would send them to Carlisle, because Carlisle was on the train route from the West to Washington, D.C. And many of these parents petitioned Congress, people petitioned the president to say, we will go to Washington, D.C. if we can see our children at Carlisle. So they were literally holding these children hostage. And the Carlisle barracks, even in the report, I read a memorandum of Carlisle. Even in the report, it says the the Carlisle barracks was created in 1755, I believe. It's one of the oldest military installations in the United States. It still operates as it's still functioning. It's the Army War College. It's still a military active military base today. And at the time, they made this weird agreement between um, the the military and the Department of Interior to have this quote unquote experiment, and it was basically an abandoned cavalry barracks that was there, and children were sent there with like and basically had to build the school themselves because it wasn't a school; it was just a military base that they went to. And people like Luther Standing Bear, who wrote about this in his two books, The Land of Spotted Eagle and um, My Indian Boyhood. He talks about how, as part of the first class of Carlisle, he was from Rosebud and Oglala, kind of in the middle. There's debates about he's kind of both Sichongu and Oglala Lakota, but he went there as a first class, and he says that half of his classmates died, in the first 2 years that he was there, and I think they sent somewhere between 50 to 60 children. So just that first class, it was like really fascinating and sad. Um, so this is, this kind of operated hand in hand with a longer or larger federal policy that was both like I think as Jen, as you just pointed out, Jen, that worked in tandem with military subjugation of indigenous people and the in the case of the Apache or in the case of of Lakota people, it's no accident that these children wound up on military bases and were inculcated in not just U.S. patriotism and flag worship, but were also inculcated with military discipline. That was one of the primary purposes. And when you read these reports, as Jen and I have done, the goal was not to like make these, and they would even say this like do not tell your children that they will become that because of education they will get a high salary. You know, make them aspire to the level of their quote unquote peers, which are not white people, but which are people such as indigenous people who work hard labor. So teach them vocational skills, teach them how to break a rock, use a hammer, right? Sew a dress, but don't teach them like the kind of intellectual endeavors that one would normally assume would be part of a um, a kind of a modern education. And so a lot of these children were basically employed, quote unquote, by the schools themselves, or were, quote unquote, employed by white ranchers or, white businesses who needed cheap labor or, in some instances, free labor. So this was the practice of the school itself. It wasn't about education. Many of the children who went to these schools never graduated.
Right. And, in addition to, sorry about that, let me mute my computer. In addition to that, um, food rations were being withheld if parents refused to take or send their children to boarding school. And the boarding school system was also a means of acquiring native land because they would threaten native parents, or they would, um, yeah, they would threaten native parents and with taking their children in exchange for their land, or they would say, if you want to visit your children, you got to give up your land. And there's that famous photo that goes around, right, of the parents who erected teepees outside of the boarding school, right? Like, it's blatant displacement. And even just today, I came across, and just one day, I came across two correspondences talking about coercion to send children to boarding school, the coercion of Native parents. In one instance, um, an Indian agent was writing to the then Commissioner of Indian Affairs saying, should I threaten to withhold rations if students are truant? And the commissioner, of course, was like, yes, it's good and well that you should do this too. And I think he like literally used the language of discipline, right? And then in another instance, it's kind of bizarre. A representative of Wells Fargo was encouraging Native parents um, to um, withhold their kids from boarding schools if they didn't get their rations. And so I was like, I don't understand how that benefited Wells Fargo or if it even had anything to do with that, but they were like, we will see that this man is removed at once. Like, I don't, and so it's not hard to find ample evidence of this in the archive, even though the archives are so limited. These correspondences are well documented that there's systematic coercion happening, and just the blatant stealing of children too. Even the way they talk about meeting quotas for schools, right? The way they talk about how much funding is allocated to this school and how you have to meet a certain quota, you have to fill this many beds with this many students, and if there's not enough students there, you have to seek them out from other tribes or surrounding areas. Um, so it was, yeah, it was a very blatant process to eradicate, assimilate, but also to blatantly steal land and resources from Native people. And then what you were saying, Nick, about the way students left with mostly trade skills or vocational skills that were to create essentially a cheap and ready workforce or labor force for people. Right? I mean, I know several people who people who are still alive today who after boarding school were just nannies or housekeepers in white people's homes mostly. And I'd say this is just like another example of like the clear proletarianization of Native people.
Yeah, and to be clear though, it's not like really proletarianization to be like it's not like a massive labor pool though either, because it's like even Luther Standing Bear in his memoir, he says, "Yeah, I was trained as a tinner. I can make things out of tin." But he's like, "I went back to the reservation, but my skills were useless because there was no tin shop."
Oh, that picture you found with the like the assimilation ceremony where they
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to allotment policy. There was it's kind of a little bit tangential, but I think it's also important. It plays into this whole idea of like civilization and an approximation to what a lot of these Indian agents saw as whiteness, and they would say this in their reports. So parents, during allotment, a family or a head of household was allotted about 160 acres of land, depending on where, and then surplus land was sold off, often to whites. I think there was like 90 million acres. That was essentially like considered quote unquote surplus land that was sold off. Um, and they would have these competency commissions that would go around for allottees, people who are allotted, their land, to work as farmers basically, or to develop the land and to such a degree that they could live off of it sustainably. And it's like most families who are allotted land, or most individuals who are allotted land, often never went to that land because it was literally just scribbled on a piece of paper. And then, like much like our Indian money accounts, I can't go to the government and be like, I want to cash out my individual Indian money account, write me a check. They'd probably be like, oh, we don't know where it's at, where's the money? um and behind the scenes there's like an Oz figure just like printing out $100 Benjamins. Anyways, because it's all fake. But these competency commissions were set up to like prove that through agriculture, through working the land, through managing cattle or whatever it was that somebody was doing with their land, that these indigenous people most often were considered quote unquote full bloods, those who couldn't speak English very well or didn't speak English at all, and often were considered like almost unassimilatable or unable to assimilate. They were considered ineligible for citizenship or ineligible to own land in private. And that's important to note that most, even today, competency commissions, or competency tests still exist. They never went away. It's just practiced with less frequency, and it's practiced for other reasons that I don't have time to get into. But for the sake of putting one's land from a trust relation from trust into private ownership, one had to prove themselves capable of, not only speaking and understanding English, but also being a proper American citizen and taking an oath and waving a flag. And so they had these competency. I think it was McLaughlin, who was the former superintendent at Standing Rock Agency and also played a hand in assassinating Sitting Bull. In the 1910s, he set up these competency commissions, which had this whole ceremony. And he was down in Yankton, in the Yankton Reservation, and he was handing basically the competency ceremony was this: the freed Indian who became a citizen of the United States was in a teepee, stepped out of the teepee, shot an arrow, like as if like I'm gonna I'm foregoing my ancestral and primitive ways, and then grabbed a plow and got a flag. So it was like a very kind of symbolic act, but this idea of competency like worked in different ways because quote unquote mixed bloods, those who were more approximated to whiteness, were often granted competency or fee simple or access to privatize their land more so than people who were considered full blood or those who were considered traditional or backwards, right? And that's an important distinction for a variety of reasons, but it's also part of another tactic of just getting people to relinquish their land, because in other instances, when people were considered incompetent, in the case of a lot of indigenous people in Oklahoma, there was an active oil boom, going on, and those who were considered incompetent couldn't manage their own affairs and were put into a conservatorship, much in the same way that Britney Spears was put into a conservatorship by her father. Granted a power of attorney by the court to basically manage the affairs, the business affairs, and this happened to like thousands or hundreds of indigenous people and landowners. They were declared incompetent by the courts, and then it was a whole scheme. Like the lawyers, it's the premise of that book, Flowers, Killers of the Flower Moon, about the Osage oil murders, but it was ongoing, for quite some time. And so competency, played a huge role. And if one had attended boarding school, one was more likely to be deemed competent as well. And I saw some of that in the files. Like they may have been full blood, considered full blood, but nonetheless they spoke English and they flew the American flag or whatever it was, and then therefore they could sell their land. And most often, the people who were deemed competent often just sold their land because they needed it for money, for survival, and so they sold it to white people, and that's where you get fractionation on reservation land. So allotment opened surplus land for whites, and then in the course of competency, quote unquote, or citizenship, it allowed Native people to sell their land to white people on one hand, or if they were deemed incompetent and then put into a conservatorship, it allowed white people to come in and steal the resources that way. And so this is that whole kind of back and forth. And just to go back to Indian child removal, and I think this is one of the sections of the report itself. And after 1871, Congress enacted a series of laws to basically order Indian parents to send their children to school and to authorize the Secretary of Interior to issue regulations to quote unquote secure the enrollment and regular attendance of eligible Indian children who are wards of the government in schools maintained for their benefit by the United States or in public schools. So this, as you pointed out, Jen, kind of basically, coerced families into sending their children to these schools. And this happened in many ways, in a variety of ways, often through coercion or force. And I read some reports where Indian police or Indian agents were actually going out and saying, you will get money if you send your children to school. And in the case of I think, if we think about how we have today we have what is called the poverty draft, where we have an entirely volunteer run military, but a lot of people join because of economic situations. And a lot of like the churches who were getting federal money, or Johnson O'Malley money later on, as it was called, were parents who volunteered their children. They voluntarily gave up their children to the church, basically, to go to these schools. I would say my family included. Many of my aunts and uncles went to these schools, but I think maybe like my grandparents had an idea of Christian education or whatever, but really they were just poor and they couldn't take care of them. So is that really voluntary? You know, is that voluntary? Is that the voluntary giving up of children? I don't think so. I think it's creating economic and social conditions where that becomes the only option, and that too in itself should be considered a form of child removal. Um, that parents are put into this situation where they can't even take care of their own children, and the resources that they should be receiving for those children are instead going to church groups or going to boarding schools, where their children will face high rates of sexual abuse and violence. And that was something that was also fascinating about the research that we've been doing at the National Archives here, is that there are many instances of complaints and investigations of sexual abuse against of Native children in these things. It wasn't really covered up, and it makes me wonder. We see the official record of it, right? And the allegations that existed and the investigations. Many of them were found, not liable in these cases, or were proven not guilty because their accusers were children, right? They were minors. They were wards of the government. They didn't have any power, any standing. But how many, didn't come forward? How many do we not know about? And the prevalence of these kind of these instances of sexual abuse, and in many ways, a lot of, especially like we know about the Catholic Church, clergy, and the prevalence of sexual abuse in the clergy in other places, especially when it happens to white people. But there's been an active kind of attempt to erase that and how it's happened to Native people at these schools specifically, and not just at Catholic, or faith-based schools, but also at regular, boarding schools, federally run boarding schools. And whatever people say, it's not just about, there's not a clean kind of dichotomy, or, it's not black and white. It's like, not to say that like the federal schools were somehow secular and the faith-based schools weren't, because the federal schools actually required and had circulars that required children to, or they compelled children to attend mass a certain amount of times, or compelled them to learn the Lord's Prayer and to read a certain Bible, right? So they were taking federal money and basically, inculcating Christianity or Christianizing Native children from the federal side. Yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything about that particular thing, because I think it's prevalent in this report, but it's also a little bit murky, because there were, and we'll talk about this in the wrap up and the analysis, but there was a large investigation of a lot of these Catholic schools in Canada, and that were taking First Nations children's, and the abuse that happened, and there was a class action lawsuit that resulted from it. And there's a demand for an apology from the Pope, and I think he did apologize. I read the thing and it didn't really seem like an apology to me, but I don't know. Nobody says, sorry. But that instance was interesting, because while we have access to the records, the federal records, and there's this report, it makes me wonder how the federal government is going to respond to the church, which seals its records, and it seals the records of a lot of its priests, especially those who have been credibly accused. It's hard to get. They don't open the file until 50 years after the priest's death, right? And there are special rules that kind of like, even though they might have accepted like Johnson O'Malley money, which came out of the Indian Reorganization Act and therefore is federal money, they accept it for the care of children, but not necessarily the education of those children. So they excuse themselves from like, oh, well, we're not like subject to certain federal laws. And I think that's that's going to be an issue that I want to see, play out in this. Is like how is the Department of Interior going to respond to this? Because the Catholic Church isn't forthcoming about its records, and I don't think it will be, especially in the wake of all this.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, the Catholic mission system has existed here before the United States, and I, as we talked about earlier, the Catholic Church volunteered, to take over many of these government-funded schools, and the government was happy to allow them to do so because it meant civilization and assimilation was happening, and of course, many other churches volunteered, and so a lot of the government-funded industrial schools that weren't Catholic, they were mostly, like Protestant, Episcopalian, and but of course, there are still many Catholic boarding schools. There's many that are still open today. There's a very notorious one in Santa Fe where a lot of Pueblo people went, called St. Kate's, and that one was notoriously violent. We have like comrades who had relatives that never came back from there, and it's, I don't expect the churches to be transparent about their history or share their archives with us. And um, even with legal scrutiny, they keep their lips shut. Like here in New Mexico, when cases broke out about rampant pedophilia within the particular diocese here in New Mexico, it took them going bankrupt to acknowledge what was happening. And so, and um, there's this kind of like historical like precedent that, or the Catholic Church has felt that they were deprioritized or underfunded by the federal government, in some cases in favor for other schools. Like, I think they frame it within the context of like the Protestant versus Catholic debate. But in all reality, these are churches that still have a stronghold in some places, like not just the Southwest, but the Dakotas too, as Nick mentioned, and of course Canada. And so, yeah, I think that this is gonna like require us to broaden the scope of how we think about government funded schools, but even non-government funded schools. Thinking about how deep the mission system goes back and how the precedent was there even prior to um, the United States military policy against Native people. Of course, I'm going to be critical, like Spain and Spanish colonization. I think they kind of set up U.S. federal government to uh, take the military action that they did against Native people. Um, but that's not to say that, I mean, I truly believe there is a distinct kind of evil that lies in government industrial schools. Um, Truly, truly. And I think that the more we dig and the more we look into, especially violence against children, right? And especially instances of sexual abuse, um, we might face more resistance in this. And I'm like really curious to see how the researchers and the Department of the Interior and the BIA and everybody working on this report is going to grapple with that when the time comes. I mean, the time's already here, but yeah, I'm really curious.
Yeah, there's just to kind of give you some signposts if you're reading the report. They talk about a 1908 Supreme Court, which is Quickbear versus Loop, that essentially said that monies held in treaty and trust fund accounts for Indian territories ceded to the U.S. To fund children, in, quote unquote, induced or compelled to attend Indian boarding schools that were operated by a religious institution or organizations. It basically makes you know, um, uh, a First Amendment case to say that while the federal while the court held that the prohibition on federal government to spend funds on religious schools did not apply to Indian treaty funds, did not violate the Indian Appropriation Acts, and forbid such expenditures would violate the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. So yeah, so that's an interesting kind of loophole or legal precedent that was set by the federal court system to essentially allow federal money to be funding religious institutions. And the other thing, just to kind of wrap this up, it's there was this quote from the Meriam Report, which really exposed a lot of the corruption that was happening in the Indian service, as well as um, across Indian reservations in the 1910s and into the 20s. And the Meriam Report came out in 1928, and it really kind of opened the door for certain reforms. But there's this quote I wanted to read from it. Hold on, let me find it really quick. That basically sums up what the so-called, what they call in here, systematic identity alteration, which is like a really fancy word for I don't know, I guess assimilation or genocide. Um, so when the department, was studying the economic and social conditions of American Indians across the country, they came to the conclusion that, on the whole, the government practices may said have been operated against the development of wholesome Indian family life. Chief of these is the long continued policy of educating the Indian children in boarding schools, far from their homes, taking them from their parents when small, and keeping them away until parents and children become strangers to each other. The theory was once held that the problem of the Indian could be solved by educating the children, not to return to the reservation, but to be absorbed one by one into the white population. This plan involved the permanent breaking of family ties, but provided for the children a substitute for their own family life by placing them in good homes of whites for vacations and sometimes longer, the so called outing system. The plan failed, partly because it was weak on the vocational side, but largely by reasons of its artificiality. Nevertheless, this worst of its features still persists today, and many children today have not seen their parents or brothers and sisters in years. One thing that's not, I mean, that's a really compelling quote from that thing, but it's, this was 4 years after Indians were, unilaterally made American citizens or granted, or American citizenship was unilaterally imposed on American Indians. But the Carlisle Indian School closed down at the outbreak of World War One. I think it was in 1918, and many of those children from Carlisle. I don't know if there's ever been a study, but from what I've read from some of the student files, many of them enlisted in the military as non-citizens. Some of them were actually underage because they basically got, you know, a, a basic training. They got boot camp while they were in boarding school. And I don't know if there were recruiters there, but the militarized conditions of these schools basically, you know, help them matriculate into service. And there's all these arguments now that are made by recruiters in the U.S. military, and this even our own veterans of the U.S.'s imperial wars in our communities, to say that we have some kind of warrior tradition in service of this country. And I don't think it's adequately been studied about the impact of boarding schools and that militarization and that military mindset. Because, Fool's Crow, he had this really famous saying when he spoke in front of a Civil Rights Commission. I think it was in 1978. And he was one of our famous Lakota chiefs. He said, we sent our children and our boys to fight for this country, to fight for our land, to get a hearing essentially of the Black Hills case in Congress. But instead, they came back as like drunks. They were broken because you sent them to fight in a foreign country. You like violated this agreement with us. So I thought it was like that isn't really touched on this in this report at all. But I wanted to point it out because it was something that was like that I noticed as a trend, specifically at this time period. So I think oh, did you want to say something?
I was gonna say too, like I mean, right at the beginning of the 20th century in World War One, Native people were the most overrepresented group of non-citizens fighting on the side of the U.S. And so I think that just like clearly, I mean, that shows the impacts of the boarding schools right there. It wasn't that there was like some kind of inherent sense of national pride or this idea that Native people were going to fight to defend their homeland, which is how it's always framed to us. It was, again, people going out of necessity, being promised benefits, and like like Nick said, the military training they had already received. Um, did you want to end by talking about, you know, next steps or what this first volume kind of alludes to?
Yeah, there's a series of like recommendations at the end, findings and conclusions, I guess you could say, that I think it's worth talking about. So, several of the things that they point out, and at the conclusion is like, let me pull it up here. So they kind of reiterate the main points of the report itself, but they point to kind of, and Deb Holland says this in her, and even in her press release or her press conference about language revitalization. So she says, let me pull it up. Holland said, the report is the first step toward understanding what assistance people need to overcome that trauma. She said, which includes things like mental health services and language revitalization, since children were abused and forbidden to speak from speaking their native languages at the schools. And I'm interested, like that's, and I did hear that. I heard a lot of that in the press conference, and I do think that there is a lot of trauma and there is a lot of pain and suffering that is a result of this. I mean, I've spoken with my own family about this. It's really hard to talk about, but it helps me kind of understand like why things are the way they are in our family structure, and why even though I maybe have never attended a boarding school, my dad did, and his brothers and sisters did, and many of my ancestors did as well. But why how that carries down, and there is, I think, a special kind of way to handle the trauma that comes from that. And I think there are needs that people have and they should be met. I was talking to my dad one time and he was just naming all the people in his class that had died, um, early, like from drinking, suicide, like all kinds of things, the sort of the comorbidities of colonialism, so to speak. And while like there may not have been direct deaths, as a result of the boarding school itself, there were indirect deaths because of, the abuse that they had to live with, and the trauma that they had to live with from being sexually abused, physically, mentally abused, and psychologically abused. Um, so I was thinking about that, and it's like, and I was thinking about how there are specialized experts, and this report does call for that, and I think that's important, that you need these specialized experts in kind of like community and public forums to really bring this stuff to light, but also to get people to share their stories. Um, and I think it's approaching, and I think you might have mentioned this earlier, what in Canada was implemented as a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think that's important, but I also want to like kind of talk about the Canadian situation before we jump on the Truth and Reconciliation gravy train, because the Truth and Reconciliation process that happened in Canada resulted from a class action lawsuit. So it was initially antagonistic between First Nations peoples and the Canadian government and the Crown, right? It wasn't because Canada was just like, we're having a come to God moment, and we're gonna, do millions of hours of testimony about the traumas and the abuses that Native people have sustained at the hands of, our system and and genocide. It happened because they were kind of forced to do that because of a class action lawsuit. This is not a class action lawsuit against the United States government. The reason why we know about the mismanagement of funds in the Cobell case is because of a class action lawsuit against the federal government. And so I'm interested because it's like, in that, I have my critiques of Truth and Reconciliation, but at the same time, it was like there was like a legal mechanism put in place to make that happen. It wasn't, it was Native people twisting the arm of the state to make it happen. And where in this case, it's like, we do have somebody like Deb Holland, who I think is doing a really amazing job, but it's like nobody wants to say the word genocide. Nobody wants to, are there going to be like payouts? Are there going to be like reparations? Is there, because in many of these cases, it's like when you did the settlement for the Cobell settlement, you paid pennies on the dollar of what was actually taken. And so how do it's not to say like, oh, everyone should get a check, but it's like, how do you restore this? Because We can go back into the receipts and find, yeah, 90 million acres of land that we can account for, right? That we don't want back, but we deserve back because of this system, right? How are you going to replace all of those children, all those lives that were destroyed? I don't know. That's it's a very complicated question, and it doesn't even approach the other question of, and I would like to hear your thoughts about this, about sort of the politics, the liberal politics of trauma, and how, looking at the Canadian example, how they've underwent this years long process of almost like a decade of truth and reconciliation, but Canada's still building pipelines. Canada's still arresting, mothers. Canada's still killing Indigenous people. Canada is still murdering Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people. Canada is still stealing children, right? Nothing was ever quote unquote reconciled. Nothing, there was never conciliation to begin with. So how can you have reconciliation? And there was never conciliation to begin with boarding schools themselves. And I heard somebody say this the other day, I won't name names, but they're like, how do we repair this system? And it's like, well, the system isn't broken. It's actually functioning as it should. Like, there's a reason why, that 80% of children were going through a federal Indian boarding school system or federal Indian education system by the turn of the century. There was a system in place. This is systematic genocide. And how do you undo genocide? I don't know, because there are clear culprits. There are clear losses and quantifiable losses in terms of land that you can lay out, but this process and what is laid out here doesn't really allow for that, other than to say, we don't, this is kind of identifying the scope of the problem, and we don't even know what the scope is, and we need to do more research.
Right. I mean, my fear is that it'll just simply devolve into a truth and reconciliation process, where, you know, while we still struggle within our own communities to have these conversations in open forums about, generational trauma, instead, we'd end up being given a platform where, um, you know, our trauma could then be consumed and it's made a spectacle of before we even have a chance to, you know, process it amongst ourselves. And it then becomes just kind of a, like in in Canada, it just becomes a display of trauma, display of hurt for public consumption, and that's supposed to suffice for all the damage, for the genocide, for the stolen children, and then that would then set a precedent here for how reconciliation is talked about, and um, for what justice means, and that would be, I mean, it's neoliberalism, like it would be disturbing to see that happen, but I also wouldn't be surprised, right? And the report, though, does specify, it says tribes are interested in public forums for people to account these things. And so I'm interested in hearing what exactly the tribes have in mind, because again, it's going to differ pretty drastically from tribe to tribe. And I think we need, I don't know, I know that within communities, that hurt is still abundant. The ongoing abuse, you know, is still abundant, and we need to have honest conversations amongst ourselves before we take this and put it on display in a public forum like that. Especially when it's being framed as a fix-all or a cure-all, which, yeah, I that's just my biggest fear, and I think that's like a hot topic. That's how people are. I think that's a big question that's on people's minds since this has come out. Um, yeah, but I'm interested in kind of like reframing it. Like, how do we? I mean, it's hard to answer questions, right? And I think it's going to be different everywhere. But um, what is ultimately going to come of this? And I hope that it inspires Native nations to further assert their sovereignty. I hope it inspires Native nations to demand more of the federal government. Like, truly, that's what I'd love to see in my lifetime personally.
And the other thing for me is like, this isn't a permanent like project, because Deb Holland, if somebody else is elected, if Biden, is out of office, or even if another Democrat comes in, she could easily be replaced and this whole project could be scrapped. I mean, we saw that, like, there was like minimal gains in the Obama administration. That's why we had the Cobell settlement. That's why we had the Keeps Eagle settlement with all their problems. There was like, tens of billions of dollars, to basically settle accounts, outstanding accounts with indigenous nations. And it's those aren't without their problems, but nonetheless, it's like 4 years of Trump undid not only like the minimal progress, but actually set us back decades in terms of where we should be going, not just in Indian affairs, but in a lot of respects. And I don't think that, like, I think the Biden administration has proven like willing to do certain things, but it's also tepid about other things as well. And I just remain pessimistic about this, because I don't, just looking at how the federal system operates, it's like, even looking at like the change of leadership and the change of policy over the years, it just changes on a dime because of whatever political appointee gets in there. Sure, we have somebody in there who's like really pushing this, but we might not have that in a year, 2 years, 3 years. That might not be the case. And so how is this going to be sustainable? My question is, like, why isn't a class action lawsuit a way to keep this alive? And not a class action lawsuit seeking necessarily, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm just making this up. So everyone who's a lawyer can just criticize me, but instead of seeking monetary damages, why not actually seek like material return, of resources, of lands? Like, we can identify these lands. There's a, this institution, the educational institution and infrastructure of the United States isn't just limited to Indian boarding schools. We've done episodes on, universities who have benefited from stolen Indian land from the land grant, the Morrill Act, and have accumulated wealth on that as well. Like we have the receipts, like, pay up, and I don't, it's not like the federal government just had a soft moment in this moment in time. There are so many systematic things that need to be done. And the only reason that Deb Haaland is in that position, and the only reason, things like the return of Blue Lake in 1972 happened, or even, a change in Indian policy and the attempted reversal of Indian child removal with the passage of the 1977 Indian Child Removal Act, or even, keep going back, we have like things such as like the Indian Reorganization Act, as however like ill-conceived that was, it was a response to the Meriam Report and the theft and plunder of indigenous lands and the dire conditions of reservation life. That all happened because of movements of resistance, right? Deb Haaland has her position because she launched her career, at Standing Rock, or her political career at Standing Rock. In many ways, maybe she didn't, but I would say that she had that kind of cultural cachet, right? She has been a strong supporter of Leonard Peltier, who also represents that, that embodies that resistance. And even in her position, and even with those credentials and backing, though, she has proven to be, conciliatory to the powers that be, and especially like the oil and gas industry and the status quo of Washington, D.C. So we can see the limits of those things. And so it can't just be, I think there's a tendency to think like that the United States is this kind of technocratic empire where if we just get the right people in, we get the right policies, we move the deck chairs on the Titanic around enough, it'll stop the ship from sinking. But that's not going to happen, right? She's more of a reflection of movements than we are a reflection of the state, of things in the federal government. So I think that that's always important to keep in mind, that this should empower tribes at a tribal level, but also we are more than just tribal governments. We are more than just IRA governments. We are more than just tribal councils. We are movements of people, and we do have an obligation to take this a step further and to demand justice, and justice on our terms, not defined by the Department of Interior. And I don't think that they're trying to do that, but I think there might be a tendency to just kind of like let it lapse into their control. And I think there needs to be an initiative to really push for more, like in the case of, I can think of several cases where people were seeking monetary compensation for their experiences at boarding schools. They've won some of them against the Catholic Church in certain dioceses and got those churches shut down and returned those school grounds back to the tribes. It's a huge material benefit. But the Catholic Church is one of the largest non-governmental landowners, or is the largest non-governmental landowner. And I think the federal government really, plays a role in how they've accumulated a lot of that land here in the States. And it's not just the Catholic Church. There's other denominations. This doesn't even touch on. I don't think I don't remember reading it. It could be in there. Let me do a quick search before I say something that's untrue. But yep, no, they don't talk about Mormon, the Mormon, the Mormon influence on taking Native children as well and converting them to Mormonism and the taking of Native land. But they did play a huge role in that as well, and I think that needs to be accounted for. So the the receipts are this high, and I don't know where this is going, but I'm encouraged that it's happening. I just hope that there's more conversations, and it's a hard thing to talk about because this isn't fast news. This isn't like breaking news to Native people. The report kind of like hit at a time. There's Ukraine war, whatever was going on, inflation, baby formula shortage, and it kind of just got lost in the headlines of things. But this is still an ongoing process. Indian child removal never stopped. It's still happening today. And so that was a critique that I had of this. It's like boarding schools, there are still boarding schools that exist. And, there are still survivors of boarding schools that have, experienced a lot of the things that are talked about in this report. It's not just a thing of the past. It's a very, very much alive in the present and can be dealt with. These people have names, these institutions have names, they have resources, they have capital, they have influence. And, we just really need to, I think, take account of that this is this is like I think it's a good attempt at kind of laying out this larger issue. But we can't just be flat-footed in this moment. And there's going to be, and also to understand that this is a century and a half of just pure violence and just horrific, nightmarish violence against Native people. It's going to take probably more than a century and a half to undo that kind of violence.
Expect the federal government to do that undoing, right? They can't. You can't look to the source of the problem, like the Red Deal says, right? Um, of course, I mean, deep, hopeful future. I'm looking to see Native nations build stronger relationships amongst themselves, within and outside of the United States. Ayo, plurinationalism. Like, let's see what, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that in a weird way, as disturbing, hang on, as disturbing as this report is, I think it can actually serve to be empowering in some ways, right? Um, I hope it's a wake up call to leaders, but also just to everyday Indigenous people. And I hope that it helps put things into perspective and helps us realize that our fight is much older and much longer than a lot of us realize. I hope it helps people connect the dots in a lot of ways and understand that no, things aren't just, we're not talking about things that happened in the past. We're talking about the present and we're talking about our future and we're talking about our status as people in the United States. And so, yeah, again, it's movements and it's people power, I think, that are going to ultimately push this in a productive way.
Right. Yeah, and I just want to kind of reiterate as we wrap up that there are resources available for folks. We're going to include them in the show notes. Go to the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition website. Just Google it. It's out there. They have resources. You can find maps of where these things are at. Educate yourself. Like really, like this is. I think everyone should read this report. It does a fairly decent job of explaining federal Indian policy and expenditures. And it might sound like why do we need to know these things? But I'm definitely going to be teaching it in my courses, at the university, and I'm going to definitely be recommending this to people. It has its flaws, it has its shortcomings, but nonetheless, I think it's very historic, and it's kind of like it's strange to me that it didn't get the kind of attention that it deserved. It should be like, breaking news that genocide, the federal government has officially come and acknowledged, like, and documented its genocide against Indian children for over a century. That to me was kind of like a huge disappointment. But at the same time, it's like this country has, it has amnesia, and it's part of elimination is the disappearance of Native people and histories, and so it makes the colonization process that much easier, and so it's easy to forget these things. While we can't forget them, because we paid for every inch of this country, and I just watched. I'm paraphrasing Phyllis Young, but this is something that I've been thinking a lot about because I have a really contentious relationship with the idea of America. Like I do, like even when they say in the West that are America, like down south when they say our America, I'm like I don't know, like I don't fully buy into that. And when I think of America, I don't think of the country. But Phyllis Young, OG Lakota Hunkpapa, um, Aimster Gangster Granny, went to the United Nations, did treaty work there. She said we have to own America, you know, and own America by me. But what she meant is that like we have to raise hell, when things go wrong, but also like we have to celebrate our victories and know when to celebrate. And we have to have not only a policy of our friends, but also we have to have a policy towards our enemies, and how we understand these things. And so I was just really thinking about what she said, and it's like we do, like as Indigenous people, it's I'm not saying like I'm not becoming like a patriotic socialist or whatever, but like we do have to own that, and I do sincerely think that this report shows that we own America. Like we literally, not only like literally own America, but metaphorically, like you can't talk about this country without talking about not only the crimes that it committed against us, but the way that we have whipped this country in battle, but also have survived despite its attempted genocide of us, and have continued to like resist and have continued to accomplish things such as challenging a quarter of carbon emissions from Canada and the United States, which is by indigenous movements. That's we're at the forefront of this, and in that sense, it's like, you know, we have to really think about the stakes of not just this report, but the stakes of the present moment, like what has gotten us to this point. And I think there's things to be completely frightful of, and they're nightmarish, while there's also a lot of hope and, a lot of momentum towards a better future.
And I'll just end by saying all my hope is with the youth, which youth are at the core of all of this. And I think that's who we should keep in mind when we're envisioning a future. Again, like it's cliche to say, but it's literal. And like I really believe that the consciousness that the youth have right now is something we all need to learn from.